In 1954, France lost a war to bicycles. I'm not joking. While French generals sat in their fortress drinking wine and naming their military positions after their mistresses, thousands of farmers and villagers were pedaling through the jungle on modified bicycles, each one carrying 400 pounds of ammunition and rice. Those bicycles would do what seemed impossible. They would defeat one of the world's most powerful militaries and end a colonial empire that had lasted nearly a century. This is the story of the Battle of Dien, but not the way you've heard it before. This is the story of history's strangest secret weapon. A story about how simple ingenuity, human determination, and yes, ordinary bicycles changed the course of world history. To understand how bicycles could win a war, we need to go back to 1946. After World War II, France wanted to reclaim what they called French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. For nearly 100 years, these had been French colonies, sources of rubber, rice, and wealth, but the Vietnamese had other plans. During World War II, Japan had occupied Vietnam. When Japan surrendered in 1945, a Vietnamese revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh declared independence. He had fought the Japanese. He had the support of the people, and he was not about to hand his country back to France. What followed was the First Indochina War. For 8 brutal years, from 1946 to 1954, France fought to keep its empire. And France had everything: modern weapons, aircraft, armored vehicles, artillery, professional soldiers from the Foreign Legion. The Vietnamese Viet Minh forces, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, had courage and popular support, but were outgunned at every turn. By 1953, France was exhausted. The war was draining the treasury. Young Frenchmen were dying in the jungles of Indochina, and people back home were asking why. The French government was desperate for a victory, something decisive that would break the Viet Minh's will and allow France to negotiate from a position of strength. Enter General Henri Navarre, the new French commander. He was confident, some said arrogant. He had a plan that he believed would win the war. He would create an unbeatable fortress in a place called Dien. Now, Dien was about as remote as you could get. A valley in the mountains of northwestern Vietnam near the border with Laos, about 200 miles from Hanoi. It was surrounded by jungle-covered mountains. There were no real roads in or out. But that was the genius of Navarre's plan, or so he thought. In November 1953, French paratroopers dropped into the valley. Within weeks, they had built not just one fortress, but a series of fortified strongpoints spread across the valley floor. They flew in 13,000 troops, elite paratroopers, foreign legionnaires, colonial soldiers from Algeria and Morocco. These were professional soldiers, battle-hardened veterans. They brought in 28 artillery pieces, 105mm howitzers, 155mm guns, mortars. They built barbed wire defenses, minefields, bunkers reinforced with logs and sandbags. They even flew in 10 M24 Chaffee light tanks. And here's where the French arrogance really shows. They named their strong points after Commander de Castries' mistresses: Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Claudine, Isabelle, Dominique, Eliane, Huguette. Can you imagine being a soldier and being told you're defending Gabrielle? Later, when these positions started falling, the radio reports would say things like, "Gabrielle has fallen," or "Beatrice is lost." The poetic irony was lost on no one. The French had absolute confidence. Yes, the valley was surrounded by hills, but their intelligence said the Vietnamese couldn't possibly move heavy artillery through that jungle and up those mountains. The terrain was too difficult. The slopes were too steep. And even if they somehow managed it, French observation planes would spot the guns immediately, and French artillery and bombers would destroy them. The commander of French artillery was Colonel Charles Piroth, a one-armed veteran who had lost his arm in World War II. He was so confident in his guns and his strategy that he made a guarantee, a personal guarantee, that no Vietnamese cannon would fire more than 3 rounds before being destroyed by his counter-battery fire. He staked his reputation on it. The French settled in. Supply planes landed daily on the airstrip they had built in the valley, bringing ammunition, food, mail from home. They even flew in 2 mobile field brothels staffed by Algerian and Vietnamese women. They brought wine, fresh baguettes. This was the French military, after all. Some soldiers later said it felt more like a strange vacation than a war zone. Meanwhile, up in the mountains, General von Guyen-Giap was watching and planning. Giap was a former history teacher who had never attended a military academy. He had learned warfare by doing it, fighting the Japanese, fighting the French. He was brilliant, patient, and he understood something the French had forgotten, that wars are not won by superior technology alone. They are won by logistics, by getting the right supplies to the right place at the right time, and by the will of the people. Giap looked at Dien Bien Phu and saw not an impregnable fortress, but a trap for the French. If he could surround them, cut them off, and bring in enough firepower, he could destroy them. But to do that, he would need to do something the French thought was impossible. He would bring heavy artillery to those mountains. The decision was made in late 1953. Giap would assemble 50,000 combat troops, 5 full divisions, around Dien Bien Phu. More than that, he would bring 200 artillery pieces, heavy guns, 105mm howitzers supplied by China and the Soviet Union, anti-aircraft guns, mortars, enough firepower to blast the French positions to rubble. But here was the problem, the seemingly insurmountable problem. How do you move 200 heavy artillery pieces through 300 miles of dense jungle, up steep mountainsides, along paths that barely exist? Each gun weighed hundreds of pounds, some weighed over a ton. You couldn't drive trucks through that jungle. The French had planes, helicopters were barely invented. What could the Vietnamese possibly use? The answer was as simple as it was revolutionary: people power and bicycles. Over 100,000 civilians were mobilized for this effort. Farmers from the Red River Delta, villagers from the mountains, men and women, teenagers, even some elderly people volunteered. They came from provinces across northern Vietnam: Thanh Hoa, Phu Tho, Vinh Phuc. When the call went out, they answered. They created a supply line that stretched over 500 kilometers, more than 300 miles, through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Jungle so thick you couldn't see 20 feet ahead. Mountains with slopes so steep you had to grab onto trees to pull yourself up. Rivers to cross. And all of this under constant threat of French bombing. For the truly heavy equipment, the artillery pieces themselves, they used pure human muscle. Thousands of people would gather around each gun. They tied ropes to the barrel, the wheels, the carriage. They laid down bamboo rollers that they would move forward as the gun advanced, inch by inch. On the steepest slopes, 50 or 60 people would push and pull a single artillery piece. When the path was too narrow, they widened it by hand. When it was too steep, they carved steps. When a gun was too big to move in one piece, they took it apart. Barrel, wheels, mount, sights. And they carried each component separately. Some pieces required several men just to carry one part. It took weeks to move some guns just a few dozen miles. There's a story about one Vietnamese soldier named Vinh Dien. On a particularly treacherous slope, the artillery piece he was helping move started to slip backward. It was going to roll down the mountain, destroying days of work. Without hesitating, Vinh Dien threw his own body against the base of the cannon, wedging himself between the gun and the cliff edge. He stopped it from falling, but his body was crushed. He died there on that slope, his sacrifice allowing the gun to reach the battlefield. Stories like this happened hundreds of times. People died building these supply routes. They died from French bombs. They died from exhaustion and disease. But they kept going. Now here's where the bicycles come in. For everything else, ammunition, food, medical supplies, equipment, They turned to an invention that had been around for decades, but had never been used quite like this: the bicycle. But not just any bicycle. These were modified, reinforced Vietnamese engineering marvels. They started with French-made Peugeot bicycles. Ironic, isn't it, that the French had sold them these bikes during colonial times, and Czech-made favorite bikes. Then they modified them for war. They reinforced the frames with bamboo struts. Bamboo is incredibly strong for its weight. They added wooden planks across the frame to spread the load. They reinforced the front fork so it could handle enormous stress. They wrapped the tires with cloth to make them more durable and quiet. They even removed the handlebars and attached long bamboo poles to the steering column so the person walking beside the bike could steer it while pushing. The result? A bicycle that could carry between 400 and 600 pounds. Some carried even more. There's a record of one bicycle carrying 724 pounds. That's nearly a third of a ton on a bicycle. To put that in perspective, modern pickup trucks typically carry less than that. How did they do it? You couldn't ride these bikes. They were far too heavy. Instead, one or two people would walk alongside, guiding the bike with that long bamboo steering pole. They used another bamboo pole inserted into the seat post to push from behind. On uphill sections, it might take 3 or 4 people per bicycle. On steep downhill slopes, they had to lean back and use all their weight to keep the bike from running away. These bicycles were organized into groups of 30 to 40, traveling together for mutual support. Each group had spare parts and tools. When a bike broke down, and they often did, the porter would move it to the side, make repairs, and catch up with the group. It was like a mobile repair shop moving through the jungle. And here's the beautiful part. The bicycles were silent. French reconnaissance planes flew overhead constantly, looking for supply lines to bomb. Trucks would have been loud, easily heard from the air, easy to spot. But thousands of bicycles moving on dirt paths, almost no sound at all, just the gentle creak of bamboo and the soft roll of wheels. They moved at night when possible to avoid airstrikes. During the day, they camouflaged the bikes with branches and leaves. If a French plane appeared, everyone would freeze and the bikes would disappear into the jungle. One porter named Ma Van Thang became legendary. He led a group of 100 bicycles, and over the course of the campaign, he made trip after trip, carrying load after load. By the end, he had transported 3,700 kilograms of supplies, more than 8,000 pounds, over a distance of 2,100 kilometers. That's over 1,300 miles on foot, pushing a loaded bicycle through jungle and mountains. Another man, Trin Ngoc, pushed a bicycle carrying 345 kilograms, 760 pounds. His bicycle is in a museum today. You can still see it. When you look at it, you can barely believe that anyone could push that much weight 1 foot in front of the other, for hundreds of miles, through mud and rain and under bombing. But they did it. Over 20,000 bicycles were mobilized for this campaign. They moved 4,620 tons of ammunition, 1,360 tons of food, fuel, medical supplies, everything an army needs. And they did it so efficiently that the supply line never broke, not once. By March 1954, everything was in place. Giap had 50,000 troops surrounding Dien Bien Phu. He had 200 artillery pieces dug into positions on the hills around the valley. And here was the brilliance. Instead of putting the guns on top of the hills where French observers could see them, Giap's engineers dug them into the reverse slopes, the backside of the mountains, facing away from the French. The guns would be rolled forward into firing position, fire a few rounds, then be pulled back into cover. The French could see the shells landing, but they couldn't see where they were coming from. Counter-battery fire was nearly impossible. It was ingenious. The French had no idea what was coming. They thought they were facing maybe 2 Vietnamese divisions at most, with maybe a few small artillery pieces. They had no idea that above them, hidden in those jungle mountains, were 200 heavy guns and 50,000 troops, all supplied by an army of civilians pushing bicycles. March 13th, 1954. 5 p.m. After months of preparation, General Giap gave the order. Open fire. The bombardment that began that afternoon was unlike anything the French had expected. Shells rained down with devastating accuracy. Vietnamese observers had spent months studying the French positions, mapping every bunker, every artillery piece, every vulnerable point. Now they directed fire with precision. Within the first hour, the French airstrip was cratered. Aircraft sitting on the runway were destroyed. French artillery positions were hit one after another. The command post was struck, killing officers. Ammunition dumps exploded in massive fireballs. The French artillerymen tried to return fire, but they couldn't locate the Vietnamese guns. They fired blindly at the hillsides, wasting precious ammunition. Their counter-battery fire hit nothing but jungle. Then came the infantry assault. Vietnamese soldiers who had spent weeks digging approach trenches closer and closer to the French lines now attacked. They hit Beatrice, one of the northern strongpoints. The fighting was intense, brutal, hand-to-hand in the darkness. By morning, Beatrice had fallen. Over 400 French soldiers were dead. The next night, they attacked Gabriel. Same result, another French position overrun. Colonel Piroth, the artillery commander who had guaranteed no Vietnamese gun would survive, couldn't bear it. On March 15th, 2 days into the battle, he went into his bunker. He pulled the pin from a hand grenade. Because he only had one arm, he couldn't throw it, so he held it against his chest. The explosion killed him instantly. His body wasn't discovered for hours. When the other officers found out, they covered up the suicide, telling the garrison he had died in a shell attack. They didn't want the men to know that their artillery commander had given up. By March 20th, the French airstrip was completely unusable. No more planes could land. Everything now had to be parachuted in. Supplies, ammunition, reinforcements. But Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns, those same guns that had been hauled up the mountains, now filled the sky with fire. Transport planes were shot down. Parachute drops had to be made from higher and higher altitudes to avoid the flak, which meant less accuracy. Many loads drifted outside the French perimeter and landed in Vietnamese hands. Imagine being a French soldier watching supplies you desperately need drift away, watching them land in the jungle where your enemy would collect them. It must have been maddening, and every night you could hear it. The sound of digging. The Vietnamese were extending their trenches closer, ever closer. Every morning, the French would wake up and realize the enemy trenches were a few meters closer than yesterday. It was like a slow-motion nightmare. The monsoon rains came. The valley turned into a sea of mud, trenches on both sides filled with water. The French wounded couldn't be evacuated, so they lay in the medical bunkers, sometimes underwater, as more wounded arrived every day. The smell of gangrene, of death, filled the air. French soldiers later described it as hell on earth. Constant artillery fire, no sleep, terrible food, watching friends die, knowing that rescue wasn't coming. The perimeter shrank day by day as position after position fell. Meanwhile, through all of this, those bicycles kept moving. Rain or shine, day or night, more ammunition rolled in, more food, more reinforcements. The supply line held. Vietnamese soldiers at the front never ran out of bullets. They always had rice to eat. The logistics, that unglamorous but essential element of war, worked perfectly. The French government in Paris was panicking. Prime Minister Joseph Laniel and Foreign Minister Georges Bidault approached the Americans. Could the U.S. bomb the Vietnamese positions? Could they drop paratroopers to reinforce Dien Bien Phu? There were even discussions, serious discussions about using atomic bombs. President Eisenhower said no. He had just gotten America out of Korea. He wasn't about to start another Asian war. He told the French that America would only help if Britain agreed to participate. Britain refused. Winston Churchill knew a lost cause when he saw one. The French were alone. April turned to May. The siege continued. French soldiers joked bitterly that the valley resembled a toilet bowl. They called it La Cuvette. They were at the bottom, and everything was falling on them from above. Some men cracked under the pressure, some deserted, slipping into the jungle hoping to reach Laos. Most were never heard from again. The Vietnamese attacks continued, methodical and relentless. They would shell a position for days, then assault it, overwhelm it, move on to the next. Anne-Marie fell. Huguette fell. Dominique fell. Claudine fell. The mistresses were dropping one by one. By early May, the French controlled barely a square mile. They had perhaps 3,000 able-bodied soldiers left. Ammunition was nearly gone. The wounded filled every bunker, every hole. There was talk of a breakout, a desperate attempt to fight through to Laos, but everyone knew it was suicide. May 7th, 1954. After 57 days of siege, the Vietnamese launched their final assault. They came in waves, overwhelming the last French positions. There was fierce fighting, but the outcome was inevitable. By late afternoon, it was over. At 5:30 p.m., General de Castries ordered his men to cease fire. He didn't raise a white flag. That would have been official surrender, which Paris had forbidden. Instead, he simply ordered his men to stop fighting. It was surrender in everything but name. Out of the 13,000 French troops who had been at Dien Bien Phu, only 73 men managed to escape through the jungle. About 2,300 were dead. Another 1,700 were missing. The remaining 10,000 became prisoners of war. Those prisoners faced a nightmare. The Vietnamese marched them over 300 miles to prison camps in the northeast. The march took weeks. The men were already exhausted, wounded, sick. Many had dysentery. There was little food, little water. Vietnamese guards, some of whom had lost family to French bombs, were not gentle. Men died every day on that march, collapsing by the roadside. Of the 10,000 captured, only about 3,300 would survive to be released 4 months later. The Vietnamese had won, but it cost them dearly, too. Their casualties were severe. At least 23,000 men killed or wounded, possibly more. They never released exact figures. Every family in northern Vietnam seemed to know someone who had died at Dien Bien Phu. The victory was celebrated, but it was a victory soaked in blood. Still, they had done the impossible. Farmers and villagers with bicycles had defeated the French Empire. The news shocked the world, front-page headlines everywhere. Dien Bien Phu falls, French defeated in Indochina. In Paris, the government fell within weeks. In Asia and Africa, colonized peoples took notice. If the Vietnamese could beat the French, what did that mean for other colonies? Within 2 months, the Geneva Conference divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. The South would initially be under Emperor Bao Dai, later replaced by Ngo Dinh Diem, supported by the United States. Vietnam was supposed to hold elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but those elections never happened. France packed up and left. After nearly a century of colonial rule, after 8 years of war, after 75,000 French dead, they were done. The last French troops departed Vietnam in 1956. Their empire in Southeast Asia was finished. And what ended it? Not just the bravery of Vietnamese soldiers, though that was crucial. Not just the brilliance of General Giap, though he was indeed brilliant. What really ended it was logistics. It was thousands of ordinary people, farmers, villagers, teenagers, pushing bicycles through the jungle. It was Tu Vinh Dien dying to save a single artillery piece. It was Ma Van Thang making trip after trip with his overloaded bicycle. It was innovation and determination, and the refusal to believe that something was impossible just because the enemy said so. The French thought technology and firepower guaranteed victory. They forgot that wars are won by the side that wants it more and is willing to do whatever it takes. The Vietnamese were willing. They pushed those bicycles. They hauled those guns. They dug those trenches. And they won. Of course, the story didn't end there. Vietnam was now divided. The Americans, worried about communism spreading in Asia, began supporting South Vietnam. That support would grow into the Vietnam War, the American War, as the Vietnamese call it. From 1955 to 1975, America would make many of the same mistakes France had made. They would have overwhelming technological superiority. Helicopters, B-52 bombers, napalm, modern weapons, and they would underestimate the determination of their enemy. And the Vietnamese would use those same supply tactics, the same bicycles, to move supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. History would repeat itself. But that's another story. Today, you can visit Dien Bien Phu. It's a peaceful place now. The valley is filled with rice paddies and small houses. There's a modern town with hotels and restaurants. And there's a museum, a very good museum, where you can see artifacts from the battle. You can see the actual bicycles. They're there, behind glass, these modified frames with bamboo reinforcements. When you look at them, they seem so ordinary. Just bicycles. It's hard to believe they changed history. You can visit the hill where Vietnamese artillery was hidden. You can walk through the tunnels and bunkers. You can stand in the valley where the French fortress was and look up at those mountains and think, how did they possibly get those guns up there? But they did. And that's the point. The lesson of Dien Bien Phu isn't just about Vietnam or France or colonialism or communism. It's a lesson about underestimating your opponent, about assuming that technology beats determination, about forgetting that in war, as in life, logistics matter. Getting the right thing to the right place at the right time matters, and simple tools in determined hands can be more powerful than the most advanced weapons in the world. The French generals sipping wine in their fortress couldn't imagine losing to peasants on bicycles. That failure of imagination cost them everything. Never underestimate the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Never assume that your advantages make you unbeatable. And never, ever forget that sometimes the strangest weapon, a simple bicycle, can win a war. That's the story of how 20,000 bicycles destroyed the French Empire. It's a story about logistics, determination, and human ingenuity. It's a story about people who refused to believe something was impossible just because someone in authority said it was. And it's a story worth remembering.